lishma. It means study for its own sake. Study for the joy of studying. There will not be much of practical value and application in our studies. So it's study for the beauty and joy of learning. Now, I have a handout that I'd like to distribute. And this is going to be an introduction of a great deal of material. Every sentence on the first 3 pages of this handout could merit an entire course. So this is dense, as we say, and so I invite your concentration. If you don't get this, then you might be at a disadvantage as the class goes on. But we're now going to nail down what is the Mishnah, what is the Talmud, what is the oral law, what is the relationship between these two great books. I believe we made 30 copies of the handout.
We're about 8 or 10 short.
All right, so maybe some people can share. And you know what? I see Adam, looks like Adam, can you take one of these handouts and have Debbie make a dozen more? Thank you.
How about more chairs, Rabbi?
More chairs?
We'll get them prepared next week. We really...
Yeah, this is a test, yes.
Yeah.
This is a test. This is only a test. Or as my students would say, will this be on the test? I always say yes. Because then you see the notebooks open, the pens come out, and even if they're not learning, they're writing. All right, do all of you have at least a handout to share? No, not at that side? Not here? 2 people next to each other to share?
I can share with Ellen until we get the...
They'll be here in a minute.
Okay, they'll be here, but by the time they get here, we'll be long past the beginning. Anybody else?
Someone else have to have one? I've already memorized
When I was in high school, I took the Evelyn Wood
Speed reading course.
with your fingers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Did not work. Did not. Besides, it wasn't enjoyable. All right. This is titled The Oral Law. Next to it is the Hebrew in transliteration for oral law. Torah Sheba'al Peh. Peh is the mouth. The oral law. At Mount Sinai, the Jewish people received 2 Torahs. If it wasn't enough to have 1 Torah, we received 2 Torahs. Because as the expression in French goes, schwer zu sein ein Yid. It's hard to be Jewish. So we have not 1, but 2 Torahs. There's the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, written on parchment by a sofer and housed in our ark. That's called the Torah Shebichtav. You see it there? Maybe you remember from Hebrew school, Ani Kotev.
Yeah.
Ani Kotevet. I am writing for a man, I am writing for a woman. Torah Shebiktav is the Torah that is written. And there is the oral Torah. Torah Sheba'al Peh. The oral Torah was the oral explanation of how the written laws should be executed and followed. The oral Torah passed from generation to generation and was never written down. Hence the word oral, because it was meant to be fluid. The written Torah was fixed. The oral Torah is fluid. The principles of the written Torah stayed the same, but the application of these principles was meant to be adapted to all types of new circumstances. Have I lost you yet?
No?
Now this worked well as long as the Sanhedrin, you ever heard this expression? The Sanhedrin, the central authority, the Supreme Court, as long as the Sanhedrin remained intact, because this court of scholars guaranteed that the chain of transmission would not be interrupted from generation to generation. Teachers of the Sanhedrin were able to freely pass on their wisdom to the next generation of students orally. But in the days since the destruction of the temple, when was that? 70 Common Era, CE. What year? 70. All right. The Sanhedrin had been repeatedly uprooted, and its teachers had to go into hiding. Here is the pivotal man of the hour, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Who needs another, all right, there's Debbie. More coming? Okay, thank you. And the sign-in sheets going around? Good. Let's look at this name, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Rabbi Judah the Prince. The Nasi is a prince. We call my son Jacob the Prince of Irvine.
Does that make you king?
That makes me the king.
Eliyahu.
We once had a housekeeper who referred to it as the master's bedroom. I didn't.
You can change it.
Didn't change it. So he's the prince. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince, realized that things would not get any better soon. The Romans, they did a job. He saw that the temple would not be rebuilt in his generation. That's where the Sanhedrin sat. And possibly in many generations to come. And he was prophetic, wasn't he? 2,000 years without a temple. He saw the Jews fleeing the land as a result of the constant persecutions. Maybe you heard of the Emperor Hadrian and others. Impossible living conditions under Rome. He saw that the central authority was weaker than ever and might cease altogether. So in order to make sure that this chain of transmission, by the way, we call it in Hebrew, Shalshelet HaKabbalah. Kabbalah means transmission. Kabbalah. You know this word? Transmission. Shalshelet, a chain of transmission. In order to make sure that the Shalshelet HaKabbalah of the oral teachings would never be broken, he decided, and this was so revolutionary, for the first time, the time had come to write down the oral Torah to save it. This was a mammoth undertaking, because as the generations went on, the oral law grew. As each generation added its insights and teachings to this corpus. Now Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, he had a job to do. There was probably no retirement from this job. You know, when Wendy and I first came to this temple, we ordered a Czechoslovakian Torah from London. You know about these Czechoslovakians? Some of you were here when we dedicated it.
Yeah.
I can't go into it, but there were 1,564 Torahs airlifted from Prague to London to the Westminster Synagogue, and they made these Torahs available. And we ordered them for this temple, which resides in our ark to this day. But one of the great stories is that an itinerant sofer, a scribe, he was going from shul to shul in Europe looking for work. He knocked on the door of the Westminster Synagogue. He said, "Do you have any Torahs to repair?" He said, "We have 1,563. This reminds me of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. No retirement anymore. This was the job. This is it to the rest of his life. Editing, explaining, organizing this vast amount of material. The end result was a definitive yet cryptic version of the entire oral law called the Mishnah. Mishnah is a word meaning repetition, because it was studied by repeating it in the academies and classrooms. The more you repeated it, hopefully the more it was ingrained. You heard what you were saying. The only thing better than repeating something 100 times is repeating it 101 times. And Mishnah by extension means learning. So Mishnah means learning by repetition. And in a moment, I'm going to tell you about the Mishnah. But for now, Maimonides, what's his name in Hebrew? Rambam. In his introduction to his Mishnah Torah, he wrote a corpus called the Mishnah Torah. If you want to know about this, God willing, you'll come to my adult education lectures in February, March?
February.
If they're in March, don't come in February. And if they're February. And this course is entitled The Great Books of Judaism. So I'm going to tell you what the Mishnah Torah is there, and the Shulchan Aruch, and the Midrash, and Tanakh, and all of these things. So that'll be, God willing, in February. So in his Mishnah Torah, Maimonides explains what Yehuda HaNasi did. Quote, he gathered together all the traditions, enactments, interpretations, and expositions of every position of the Torah that had either come down from Moses, our teacher, or had been deduced by the courts in successive generations. By the way, it's about 13 centuries worth of material. All this material he redacted, he edited in the Mishnah, which was diligently taught in public, and thus became universally known among the Jewish people. Judaism was the first faith to seek to democratize its learning. it seeks to spread it among all the men, women, and children. Unlike the wisdom of other cultures that kept it to themselves, to the king, to the priest, to the seer, and the masses were ignorant. And this extended in Catholicism throughout the Middle Ages. Only the priests knew, and even they had how to read and write. Judaism sought to make every Jewish person literate in learning. By the way, yeah, all right, I'll tell you. Copies of it were made and widely disseminated so that the oral law might not be forgotten in Israel. Any questions on this first page? Did everyone get this?
No.
Let's pass it back out there, please. You may have to write in the margins,
We turned
We're doing the
over.
back.
turn it over. Let me just get to one thing, because you'll remember, I'll forget. I remember I gave this, when we were talking about this analogy of life to writing a postcard, that we begin, well, nobody postcards. I'm dating myself, but you start out writing really big, and by the time you get to what you want to say, you're writing smaller and smaller and up in the margins and around the top and the side and on the stamp and on the front. You know, that's life. We start out, I've got all the room in the world. And when you reach some of our age, you realize it's a finite area. You start trying to get it all in.
Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was obviously one person in one place, and there was obviously all this oral tradition from a whole lot of different centers and scholars, and how did he get it all together? And you said, why was his word the word of what the oral tradition was?
How he compiled it all together, he requested it from the various academies, from the records of the Sanhedrin from long ago. There were rabbis who had kept the oral tradition going as best they could. And although Maimonides says he collected all the material, of course we don't know if he collected all the material, but he certainly collected the bulk of it. Why Yehuda HaNasi? He was the Nasi Hador. He was the prince of his generation. His learning, his wisdom was recognized far and wide as surpassing all others. So when he said his word was authoritative and law, he was the authority.
How many years or decades did he devote to gathering all this information together?
He devoted several decades of his life, although we cannot be absolutely sure. 3, 4, 5 decades.
Okay, so I have a question with the first sentence of the first page. I thought when he was at Mount Sinai, Moses received the tablet of the Ten Commandments and then the oral Torah. He also considered the written Torah, though. He also received the 5. What else did he receive?
There are many views on what Moses received on Mount Sinai. Some say just the 10 Commandments, or the 15, and then, you know that.
He negotiated it down.
You know. I have good news, we're down from 15 to 10. I have bad news, adultery's still in. Some say he received the entire Torah and just brought down the 10 Commandments. Some say he received, well, most say he received the oral Torah on Mount Sinai. But some say that he received the commandments and then spent the next 40 years writing down the 5 books of Moses.
Oh, okay.
All right. Let's look at the next page. There are 6 categories of Jewish law. How do we say Jewish law in Hebrew? Halakha. Remember that expression, halakha? Holech, to walk. Ani holech, I'm walking. Ani holechet. Anybody? All right. The Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi edited and put down in written form, the Mishnah. What does it mean again? Repetition or learning. Is divided into 6 segments. These segments are called orders. What is the word for order in Hebrew?
Seder.
Seder. Seder. The Passover Seder, the Seder is the order of the ritual. Seder means order. Siddur, the prayer book, the order of the prayers. The Sedra is another word for Parsha. The Sedra of the week, the portion of the week. These portions go in order. I know Rabbi Zilberman just had a little flood in his house. We spoke this morning. I told him, of course, this week the portion is Noah. So when else would it be? We're going to have one. This is the time. Just to give you a little idea. Well, he said, it's only really a few drips. I say, that's how it started. We have the Mishnah divided into 6 orders. Now wait. It is further subdivided into 63 tractates. There are 63 tractates in the 6 orders of the Mishnah. But wait, there's more, as they say on TV. The 63 tractates are divided into 525 chapters. Now, look what I did. I put these small books. This is the Mishnah, the small books, so you could see it. These are the 6 orders of the Mishnah. This is the whole Mishnah, in Hebrew and English. These 6 are divided into 63 tractates. We studied one of the tractates last year. It was called Pirkei Avot. It still is called Pirkei Avot. One of the 63 comes from here, this tractate. These 6 tractates divided into 6 orders, divided into 63 tractates and 525 chapters. What are the 6 orders of the Mishnah? Number 1, Zeraim. Z-E-R-A-I-N. You see it there? You don't have to write it down. I did the work for you. It's right there. Zeraim are seeds. This one covers all the agricultural rules and the laws for food, as well as blessings. By the way, the first tractate of the first order, which we, God willing, will study, is called Brachot, prayers. That's what we're going to start with. That's how it starts. The second order, or Seder, is called Moed. Have you ever heard the expression Chol HaMoed? Chol HaMoed. Moed is a festival, a holiday. You see it there? Chol HaMoed, the intervening days of the festival. What do I mean? Let's take Sukkot. Day 1 and 2 of Sukkot, holy, very holy. The last 2 days of Sukkot, holy. The intervening days, 3, 4, 5, 6, Chol HaMoed, the little more secular. You can do things on those days, that you couldn't do on the first and last days. Same with Pesach. Chol HaMoed, the intervening days. This one deals with Shabbat and other Jewish festivals and holy days. Moed, festivals. The third order of the Mishnah, Nashim, women, explaining all the issues between men and women. Well, that's not that big. Can't do it. Can't do it. It explains issues between men. I got a little carried away, such as marriage, divorce. And by the way, in this Mishnah, the tractates are reversed. They put divorce, gittin, before marriage. Kiddushin, to not end on an unhappy note. So that's Nashim. Fourth order is Nezikin, damages, civil, criminal law. The fifth is Kodashim. You should all know this word, Kodesh, holy. Kiddush, the sanctification of the wine, Kiddush. Kiddushin is the Hebrew word for marriage. There's no word for marriage. It's Kiddushin. It means holiness. How about the word Kedusha? Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. You know what I'm doing here?
Yes,
Up and down.
Up and down when we say the Kedusha, when it's sung so beautifully by our choir in our temple. Holy things, the fifth one, concerns the laws of the temple, the holy vessels in the temple. And finally, Taharot, Tahor, Tahara. Have you ever heard the word Tahara? You know, when you bury someone, you put them in Tahara, in the shrouds. Taharot, pure things. This concerns laws of spiritual purity and impurity. Maybe you know, for example, that a Kohen cannot go into a cemetery except for his near family because he will be rendered spiritually impure. It has nothing to do with hygiene, physical cleanliness, anything like that. Here then are the 6 orders of the Mishnah right in front of you. You'll never be mystified again. When someone asks you now, you will know. Okay? Yes?
I am mystified by all those books in the chat.
Oh, well. Oh, good. All right. We're going to clear that up in a moment. Wait, there's more. Believe me, if I took all these down off the top shelf, which I did, we're talking about it.
The shop's still there.
Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. There's going to be a test on this next time. So.
Better start.
Finished the Mishnah in 190 CE. The problem is we don't know exactly when he started. In the town of Tzipori, in the Galilee. Look, he was no longer in Jerusalem after what the Romans did to it. They had to flee to the Galilee. Not long after his death, the period known as the era of the Tanaim. Now, the Tanaim were the teachers of the Mishnaic period. Still with me? It's getting a little... It came to a close shortly after his death. The Mishnaic period was over shortly after Yehuda's death. The term Tana, as in Tanaim, is derived from the Aramaic to teach. It covered a couple of hundred years from 10 BCE to 200 CE. This is the time of the Mishnaic period. During the centuries following Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's completion, the chain of transmission, the Shalshelet Kabbalah of the Torah Shebaal Peh, was further weakened by economic hardship and increased persecution of the Jewish community in Israel, causing many Jews, including many rabbis, to flee the country. Many of these rabbis emigrated to Bavel, to Babylon, Babylonia, which is today Iraq. The role of the rabbis of Israel now as the sole central authority of the Jewish people was coming to an end. Now you had rabbis in Babylon as well as in Israel. They didn't have the sole authority anymore. Now it was becoming decentralized. And a lack of consensus among the rabbis led to further weakening of the transmission process. And it became clear to the sages of this period, as it had become clear to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, that this transmission was in danger. He saw the Mishnah alone was no longer clear enough to fully explain the oral law. The Mishnah is written in shorthand, in places it's cryptic. It's very concise. You know why? The Mishnah is written on the assumption that you know the subject matter. It assumes already that you're learning. It doesn't start at Aleph. So these later rabbis, after the Mishnaic period, began to have discussions themselves. Jews love to have discussions themselves. Sometimes it's a dialogue, more often it's two monologues. I see you've had some. And they began to write down the substance of their discussions in response to the Mishnah. So this is the time now to nail this down. You have the Torah. The Mishnah is a commentary on the Torah. The Talmud, which is the product of these later rabbis' discussions, is a commentary on the Mishnah. TMT. Torah, Mishnah, Talmud. This is one of the main understandings we have to have. Just like when you put the Hanukkah candles in, you put them in from right to left and light them from left to right. These are basic kinds of things we have to think about. I'm already looking forward to the next festival. Now look at the last paragraph on that page. Since at this time a significant portion of the Jewish population was living in Babylon, the rabbis there put together their discussions, the end product of which was called the Talmud Bavli. Bavli, Babylonian Talmud. What else would they call it? Even before this process had begun in Babylon, in the land of Israel, another set of discussions took place, and that end result was the Talmud Yerushalmi. Do you know that Yerushalmi, Yerushalayim, is Hebrew for Jerusalem? The Jerusalem Talmud. Just to make matters a little more, it wasn't written in Jerusalem, but in Tiberias, which was the last place the Sanhedrin sat. Why was it called the Jerusalem Talmud? Because that was the rightful place of the Sanhedrin. So we're calling it that in spite of what the Romans did to us. It's still the Jerusalem Talmud to us. So, dear friends, we not only have two Torahs, we have two Talmuds. All right. Any questions on that, the second of 3 pages?
Isn't the Babylonian Talmud, however, considered the definitive one compared to the Jerusalem Talmud?
The Babylonian Talmud is considered the authoritative Talmud. When a yeshiva student studies the Talmud, or anyone studies the Talmud, They're studying the Bavli, not the Yerushalmi, and I'll tell you why. Due to persecution of the Jewish community in Israel, including Tiberius, the Jerusalem Talmud was never finished. And it was never fully edited. And so it's much shorter. By the way, we don't want to deal with a shorter compendium, I mean. It contains only 4 of the 6 orders of the Mishnah. It's right there. It's harder to understand than the Babylonian Talmud. It's more cryptic. Now, the situation of the Jews in Babylon, as we see here, was much more stable. The rabbis there had more time to edit, more to explain the subject matter than their persecuted brethren back in Israel. And although there are 2 Talmuds, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, they're not really separate. Look at what it says here. The rabbis of Babylon had access to the Jerusalem Talmud while they were working on their text. But if there's a dispute between the 2 Talmuds, it's the Bavli that's followed. Both because the Bavli is more authoritative and the Yerushalmi is more difficult to study. Yeshiva Buchers are using chiefly the Bavli. Now finally, to read the Talmud is to read arguments. This is maybe why it's so beloved. The reason the rabbis argued about things that may not have any application to everyday life, you'll see that, was to try to get to truth in an abstract way, to understand the logic and to extract the principle. These rabbis were interested in knowing what reality is and in doing the right thing. Those were their 2 goals. What is reality? What is truth? What is knowledge? What is wisdom? And doing the right thing. What is morality? What are ethics? What is integrity? What is justice? The ultimate reality being God. God willing, I'm going to talk this Shabbat when we study the Tower of Babel around this table at 9 o'clock Shabbos morning about a Jewish movement that does not believe the ultimate reality is God. Now, in response to Sarah's question, these volumes here, 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 and here. This is the Talmud. I had them lined up, nice, but they kept it. Here they are. These first 2 volumes of the Talmud are a commentary on Zra'im, seeds, the first order of the Mishnah. These volumes are a commentary on Moed, festivals, Shabbat, Pesach, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. These volumes are a commentary on Nashim, marriage, divorce, etc., all those relationships.
Big pile.
So on, pardon me?
It's a big pile.
Big pile.
I think the biggest
Last one
And
is,
so on. This is the biggest pile.
yeah,
That's true.
right.
is on the women.
On the women, yes.
We rule.
Yes, you know, not in the Talmud, but okay.
Is that a commentary?
Question. Since some of these concepts like morality and justice are somewhat geographic in terms of people's interpretation, how did the 2 groups deal with the geographic differences that might have occurred in Babylon versus Jerusalem?
Well, what the Bavli attempts to do is elucidate the universal laws of the Torah in ways that are universally applicable to all Jews everywhere. Now, Jews in Israel may or may not adhere to the code of the Bavli, but this is what they tried to do. The Shulchan Aruch, for example, the book of Jewish law, which codifies how to act and behave all day and night long, every single day, was not accepted in its entirety by Ashkenazic Jews. It was written by a Sephardic Jew, Joseph Karo. You might have been in his synagogue in Sfat, but not by the Ashkenazic. So we have an attempt at uniformity, which we never achieve, because the Sanhedrin is gone. The Sanhedrin was the authoritative body. Now that it's gone, we have argument. Last 3 paragraphs. Much of the discussion and dispute is focused on relatively minor points, while the larger issues are generally not disputed in the Talmud. See where I am? You don't see a single argument as to whether to eat pork or whether fire can be kindled on Shabbat. These things were givens. They're assumed. Only small points are subject to discussion in the Talmud. And these rabbis were wise enough to know that a day would come when the principles established by getting to the core kernel of truth would have far-reaching implications. And the Talmud also contains a great deal of Agadata. They're stories that illustrate important points in the Jewish worldview. Judaism is divided between halacha, law, and agadah, stories, morality tales, which illustrate the halacha. Halacha and agadah. An example of agadah is the Midrash, which we haven't spoken about, but which, God willing, I will speak about in February as one of the great books of Judaism, the Midrash. Agadah means telling. So they told stories. There are laws about idolatry in the halakha, in the law. Maybe some of you know the story about little Abraham, the Midrash, and how he smashed the idols. You know that story we all learned most of us learned in the first week. He smashed the idols, father came home. That's a Midrash to illustrate the evils of idolatry. Agadah, as in the word Haggadah, you know the Haggadah for Passover, means narration, telling. I got to tell you something. That was funny the first time I told it years ago. Some of you have heard my routines. Now, just to... There's another word for the Talmud. Complicated. That word is Gemara. Yes? You've heard that word? Not at Sinai. In Chicago. Another word for Talmud, you see it there, is Gemara. The Aramaic word Gemara means tradition. In Hebrew, Gemara means completion. The Gemara is a compilation of the various rabbinic discussions on the Mishnah, and as such, it completes the understanding of the Mishnah. So at times in this class, I can say Talmud or the synonym Gemara, talking about the same corpus. Finally, Talmudic thinking is Middle Eastern, not European. Let me show you what I mean by this. In classical Western reasoning, one works from the general principle to the particular. All men are mortal, the general. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. From the general principle about all people to the particular about Socrates. Anybody remember that syllogism? Philosophy 101? Talmudic thinking, though, proceeds from the minor to the major. It is forbidden to write on Shabbat. How much more is it forbidden to write on Yom Kippur, a far holier day? So it goes from the minor to the major. Middle Eastern, not European. All right, questions on that third page? Yes.
How often does the Talmud do reworking?
The Talmud, the Talmudic period. Now, as the Mishnah was codified in the year 190 CE in Sapori by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. We say that the Mishnaic period ended 220 CE. Now that the Mishnaic period is over, work on the Mishnah is completely done. Because there were additions to the Mishnah after Judah Hanasi called Boreita. These are extraneous texts that were collected afterward, didn't make it into the Mishnah text, but are there, on the sides. The Talmudic period, let's say, began at 220, roughly around there, and went to the end of the 5th century. So the 200s, the 300s, the 400s, the Talmudic period ended. From that time, there has never been an addition, there has never been a subtraction of one letter from or to the Talmud. It is fixed. The Mishnah is fixed, just like the Torah is fixed. Never an emendation whatsoever. The Talmud we are studying was fixed in the 5th century. 1,500 years. Jewish students and others have been studying the exact same text. Just as we've been studying the Mishnah for longer than that, and as we've been studying the Torah for longer than that. Every word is set.
Rabbi, so the Mishnah references rabbis, teachers from the 2000 Common Era back in these books.
No. It references rabbis of the Mishnaic period, the first couple centuries CE. The Talmud or Gemara references rabbis in the 3rd century, the 4th century, and the 5th century. Their discussions in their academies, in Babylon, commenting on this often digested, cryptic text.
So in the 600 Common Era, in no Sanhedrin, who made the decision that it should never be touched again?
The rabbis of the Talmud declared it ex cathedra to be fully completed. No more. No more. They're the ones who did it. And it was accepted at the end of the 5th century because, these are, you can't even talk about them. These are,
So is Sansina, is this an interpretation of the Talmud?
we're going to see. We're going to see how the Talmud interprets the Mishnah as soon as we get into it. I'm going to show you perfectly. Not today, but God willing, you'll be back in November, and we're going to go right into it. Yeah.
The Jerusalem Talmud, so is there a definitive, is there a difference between the two?
Yeah, there's a lot of difference between them.
So does it just sit not really.
No, it's studied by academicians.
Well, it's cryptic because when you say not fully edited, it means it didn't really explain it well enough.
Well,
or-
it's very much more difficult. You're going to see that the Babylonian Talmud assumes a great deal of learning. But the Jerusalem Talmud seems more even for scholars than the Babylonian Talmud. It's really academic.
Is it followed? I mean, is there a difference?
No. The Babylonian Talmud is the only authoritative one. If there's any dispute, which we can talk about next time, it's this one.
I'm a little confused. The time of the Rambam, which is much later, then where is that?
Okay, the Rambam is the 11th century,
I know, but where is it located? I mean,
but he's located in his books.
oh, that's not.
He's not here.
Okay.
Because he lived in the 11th century and this was closed in the 5th century.
So I think,
He could try to elbow his way in, but it's closed.
in other words,
So he wrote his own books called the Mishnah Torah.
oh, in other words, that's just a
He's not here.
separate book.
Yeah, separate book.
The temple down the street.
Yeah,
So all the scholarly comments from 500 CE on is embedded in different books?
yes, different books.
Some are
For exa-
valuable and others some.
An example would be the Mishnah Torah, which is a commentary on the Talmud. And by the way, Maimonides said, all you need is the Torah and my book. As humble as he was, you don't need all this.
No ego.
He said, I've digested it all. Everything that you need to know is in my book. There's responsa literature that Rabbi Zilberman teaches here. Questions asked of rabbis, answers that they give to relate to today's conditions and circumstances, you know. I was just reading one, it wasn't included in here. There's a law against tattoos in the Torah. The Mishnah and the Talmud comment on that. People who survived the Holocaust with tattoos would write to a rabbi. Do I have to have it somehow? What do I do with this? And all that. I mean, there are things that weren't foreseen here. There are things in the Torah not foreseen. We have the Mishnah. There are things here that were not foreseen. We have the Talmud. There are things here not foreseen. We have the Mishnah Torah. We have the Shulchan Aruch. We have the responsa literature. It's ongoing today.
But it all goes back to what was written, in response to what was written.
It does. It all is based on this. No, it's not out of thin air. They all use this as proof texts. All right, let's look for, yeah.
Well, but Rashi, his commentary on the Talmud and so on, how does that increase the knowledge of the Talmud, or does he just interpret it?
Without Rashi, you can't know the Talmud.
And where,
You can't know. Well, I'll show you. I'm going to show you right now. Let's take our last 5 minutes. Look in the handout. There is a page of the Talmud. You see it? The first one.
Would the prince have said, without Rashi, you will never be able to understand what I've written?
No. But Rashi. Here is the first page of the first order of the first tractate of the first chapter of the Talmud that we are going to study directly, not about it, directly, God willing, next time. It is exactly what's on the page in front of you. This is how the Talmud begins. Now look, the name of the chapter is given from the first word of the chapter. Here it is me'ematai. That's the first word of the Talmud. From when? Me'ematai. Ever heard the expression ve'im lo achshav ematai? And if not now, when? Written in the top of the page to the right. You see it's in a square?
Yeah.
In blue, ve'ematai. You see it there? That is the name of the chapter. You see the page? Now turn the page. Next to the title of the chapter is the number of the chapter. Here, Perek Rishon, the first chapter. Perek is the word for chapter. You remember Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the fathers. Rishon is first. Rosh, first. See it there? Turn the page. Then follows the name of the tractate. 63 tractates. Here's the first one, Brachot. So what is the Talmud going to begin with? Blessings, prayers. That's the name of the whole tractate. Turn the page. As said, the title of the chapter is the first word of the text, which is introduced by the title. You see it in the middle there in the box? Me'ematai, from when? See it? That's the first word. You know, it's like in books when they illuminate the first letter or the first word. Give it prominence. Medieval manuscripts, etc. Here it's really highlighted. So that's the title of the chapter. Next page. In the middle of the page, you see it blocked off? There is the text of the Mishnah. The Talmud contains the text of the Mishnah before it goes off on its own. It shows you what the Mishnah. You don't have to go out and buy this book. It's right, just buy the Talmud and you've got the Mishnah. But not the whole Mishnah. Just what it comments on. It doesn't comment on line by line, word by word. Just what it considers to be. Okay, whatever. In the middle of the page, yes. In the middle of the page is the Talmud itself, beginning with the Mishnah. The text of the Mishnah quotes rabbis who lived from around 100 BCE to 200 CE. Among these Tanaim, remember, rabbis of the Mishnah, Tana means teacher, were rabbis Yochanan ben Zakkai. Maybe you've heard of him. He slipped out of Jerusalem and saved Judaism. Maybe we should hear of him. Important guy. And Shimon Bar Yochai wrote the Zohar. Rabbi Akiva, maybe you know Rabbi Akiva. And of course, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Never forget it. The author of the Mishnah. The text of the Gemara quotes rabbis who lived from around 200 CE to around 500 CE. The rabbis of the Mishnah were called Tanaim. The rabbis of the Talmudic period are called Amoraim. Explainers or interpreters. Now, if I said an Amora says this, you know I'm talking about a Talmudic rabbi, 300, 400, 500. If I say a Tana taught this, I'm talking about a rabbi of the Mishnah, 100, 200. The names of Babylonian Amoraim were usually preceded by the title Rav. If you see Rav, it's an Amora of the Talmud. The Amoraim of Israel continued to use Rabbi or Rebbe. This is because the institution of smicha, rabbinic ordination, was only done in Israel. They only ordained rabbis by the old procedure in Israel. They were called Rabbi or Rebbe. But a Rav, you know he's from Babylonia. Now the Mishnah text is somewhat short compared with the discussions following it. The Gemara continues on many pages before we will reach the second Mishnah. Now, some of you have to take off your glasses and look closely, or put on your glasses and look closely. But you see in the block? You see in the block? You see a large Gimel Mem, maybe 10 lines down? Gimel Mem, you see it? Yes? That starts the Gemara. What is above it is the Mishnah. Now we start the Gemara. It will go and go and go for pages and pages until we get to the second Mishnah to comment on. You see it there? Gimel Mem? A little bit large. All right? Next. Just a couple more. The text surrounding the Talmud to the right is Rashi's commentary. You see it to the right? This is how a page of the Talmud always looks. Except on the next page, when you turn it, Rashi will be on the left side instead of the right. All right? But you see Rashi outside there in the column? That's his commentary. Next one. On the other side are the Tosafot. These were disciples of Rashi who added to his commentaries. French and German. You see where I am on the left side? You see the block?
Yeah.
These are commentaries by Rashi's descendants. And along the outer part, in microscopic print, you have some later commentators. This is the way a page of the Talmud looks. This is the way a page of the page of the Talmud looks that we're going to go into, God willing, next week. Now, are there any further?
So what is it that tractate is? It's not really a subject.
No. Well, a tractate is a unit that contains material pretty much on the same subject. So that Zeraim is the first order, agriculture and blessings. And you can see why they're together, because a farmer, in ancient times certainly, God, please, there'll be some rain, some sun, some parnasa, harvest, whatever it might be. So Zeraim, the first order or seder. So the first tractate or masechet is brachot, and it contains pretty much a closed unit about blessings. Okay? Before it goes on to a next subject. 63 of those. All right. Now, you have one more question.
Is it more authoritative the closer you get to the writers of the Talmud?
Well, no, they're all held in great esteem and affection. But I'll tell you this: when you go to yeshiva, you don't study the Torah. You don't study the prophets. You don't study the writings. You don't study the Mishnah. All day long, you're studying the advanced. You're in graduate school, and you're studying the Talmud. No more of this. This is for children. This is for really people who want to delve into it. And we're going to do that, God willing. At our next class, those of you who I haven't lost completely and come back. This will be interesting. Who comes back? Have a good one.
Thank you.